So right out of the gate, it's a Twice episode, and those are always fun to dive into as we dive deeper into Twice's backstory, his history, and just honestly, just the man's psychology overall. Because obviously, we knew Twice as a character was emotionally vulnerable, just emotionally broken, and just was and after what happened to him, But this week's episode just dives deeper into just the psychology and how emotionally broken this man was. And because of those experiences and his quirk in itself, it's one of those things where he became so paranoid, so broken, so convinced of the idea that he was one of the clones, that ultimately the only way he could live his life was if he isolated himself from the rest of society. Like, I'm not joking when I say the man literally felt like he had no future at all. So all those times we've seen him acting so emotionally distraught, or seeing someone he cares about in harm's way, he feels that desperation and desperate need to save them, because the League and people like Gideon that he feels those connections with are the only ones he feels genuinely safe around, or feels like he has a place in this world. And obviously, to that point, one of the major big things about this episode, though, is that all that pain, all that trauma, all those feelings of just not feeling like he was whole, like feeling like he was one of the clones. We see Twice finally overcome all that and become whole again, and by not being weighed down by all that trauma, all those feelings of not feeling like he was himself, he was able to tap into the true potential and power of his quirk as he unleashed an entire army of clones upon the city to save Toga and help the League. And honestly, it is a triumphant point for Twice's character, no doubt. But it is in a moment like this where, as a manga reader, I can more clearly see the path that's being set for Twice's character, and ultimately where he'll end up from here and where his journey ends. And yeah. With that being said, there is a major issue with this episode I do need to bring up, and it's the first time I reference another AnyTuber's video as comparison, but Neverworld made a video about last week's episode criticizing the animation and pacing, specifically with Toga's backstory and fight. And while I mostly agreed with him that the animation in last week's episode was subpar at best, I thought the pacing of it was handled decently enough under the circumstances for me personally. But for me personally, it was more the back half that, while having the better animation, was the part that felt more rushed. This episode, however, I can't really defend all that much, because despite all the emotional and heartbreaking aspects of Twice's story I brought up, the problem is that I don't know if the pacing of the episode itself necessarily reflects those more deeply scarred emotions. And this is honestly a case where the direction Bones has gone with this season is most reflective in this episode. Because Twice's story is one of those that needs time to breathe, to soak in the emotions, and to really just kind of digest everything everything he feels. And while there were moments for that in this episode, there could have been more time dedicated to the actual to Twice's actual history, I think, and just letting us pretty much live in the moment of his life, I think, overall. And just overall letting things linger more. Now, on the flip side of that, I think the part of this episode that did do well is conveying Twice's emotions and feelings towards the idea that this entire time he's felt useless to Shigaraki and the League, but in this moment of him creating a massive army of clones of himself, for the first time in his life, he's felt like the most useful he's ever been to Shigaraki and the League. And I think that's a point in the story that I think that did correctly convey the right emotions. But unfortunately, where we needed to get those emotions, the episode did fail still. Of course, Re-Destro also makes his move in this episode after coming face-to-face with Twice and Shigaraki, where we get a look at his power. And when you really get down to it, it's basically the Hulk combined a bit with Mr. Fantastic, in the sense where the more Re-Destro accumulates accumulates stress, the stronger he becomes. But he can also kind of change his, as we see, he can also kind of change his body mass. So yeah, it's an interesting. So yeah, that's basically what his power is. But let's also talk about what's essentially Re-Destro's grandfather, Destro's backstory, and him, and Re-Destro, like, and pretty much Re-Destro recounting like the details of that backstory. Because at first I was confused when I read this in the manga. At first and thought Destro was the golden child, the one who started the Age of Quirks, and that isn't necessarily the case, because he was a child born into the world shortly after that event, one where the term quirk became a thing, but also during an era where people with these abilities were scorned, and yet ultimately, by nature of his birth and his mother still being the one who's he's ironically responsible for the world as it is today. And that, in that sense, just from Re-Destro's viewpoint of his grandfather's life, there's an interesting parallel to be drawn between Re-Destro and Destro and Xavier and Magneto. Destro, although he was ultimately a fanatic and revolutionary, when you get down to Re-Destro's life and how he lived it, like Destro wanted to ultimately change the way the world like had viewed metas simply for the sake of peace. Like at the end of the day, no matter what Destro did, no matter what actions he took, at the end of the day, he all did it because he thought it would bring peace to this world that just downright scorned and looked down upon those with abilities. It was for Destro, it was all for the sake of peace. Whereas Re-Destro, more you could say, and in that sense, like Destro has a lot of things that tie into to Charles Xavier, Professor X. He wanted peace for the mutants in the same way that Destro wanted peace for metas. Whereas Re-Destro more closely resembles Magneto in the sense where Re-Destro, he wants independence from metas just like his grandfather, but is willing to use much more forceful methods to achieve it. Methods that, as Re-Destro recounts, even his grandfather refused to resort to. Like it shows that the Re-Destro, while he believes in his grandfather's teachings, is also someone who doesn't necessarily who is willing to go that extra mile that his grandfather couldn't. He's willing to do the things his grandfather refused to do or didn't do, and that in itself is it kind of shows a little bit of the disconnect between what the Meta Liberation Army's intentions, like what the intentions of the Liberation Army were, and what they've become now, I think. And yeah, aside from that though, I guess it is worth mentioning the battle between Dobby and the Ice User, where the Ice User mentions that Dobby's flames are eating away at him. And we've heard that song and dance before, we all know what it means. But again, it's kind of amazing how, looking back, how many little details I missed from reading the manga that are only becoming apparent now after watching the season. Like, it was all right there, and yet I was still in denial to the end, right up until we got the actual reveal. But yeah, guys, that's pretty much all I've got for this review. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, Analyst, Crunchyroll, and be sure to hit the notification bell, hit the subscribe button, and just share the video around, guys. Death Knight of Anime, signing off. Later, everyone.